Hi there, it's me, Finn. And tonight, we're going to talk about something that might seem a little surprising at first, yet, strangely, calm. You might have heard of medieval nuns, the quiet convents, the long prayers, and peaceful silence. But, what if I told you things weren't always so quiet? You won't believe what some of the records say. What was happening behind those thick convent walls would puzzle even the kindest monk. Were the nuns always holy? Did they truly live in silence, far away from desire? Or were the convents themselves hiding a much softer, stranger side of human history? Tonight, we're going to take a slow journey through the hidden stories, the forgotten lives, the warm and flickering candlelit chambers of medieval convents. Let's start by subscribing. Our story starts not in the middle of a scandal, but in silence. Thick, cozy silence, soft footsteps on stone floors, and the faint smell of wax and lavender drifting from the walls. Imagine the year is 1327, a quiet convent, nestled between misty hills in France, a place where time feels paused, where everything is still. Inside the walls, Sister Marie is lighting a candle. She's young, maybe 21. Her hands are pale, a little cold, but steady. She's been living here since she was 13, after her parents died during a winter plague. She walks through the cloister garden. The gravel crunches softly beneath her sandals. It's early morning, and the air is chilly. She pulls her robe a little tighter. The sky is gray and quiet, just like every morning. But here's what most people don't know. These convents weren't always full of peace. In fact, records from abbey reports, court documents, and even papal letters show that things were far more human inside those stone walls. Let's step into their daily routine for a moment. At sunrise, the bell rings. The sisters gather in the chapel, heads bowed, robes rustling. They chant softly, ancient Latin hymns echoing like whispers through the halls. Then comes breakfast. A small bowl of porridge, sometimes with honey, if the abbess is feeling generous. Then work begins. Some grow herbs in the garden. Others copy manuscripts with delicate care. Their fingers, always cold, their minds, busy with prayer, or so it seems. But something else stirs beneath the surface. In a convent just a few valleys away, in 1302, a woman named Sister Juliana was caught sneaking out during the night. And not just once, not just for a breath of moonlight air. She had a secret path through the woods, to a nearby village, and there, she met a man. Now you might be thinking, wait, nuns? But weren't they devoted to God? Ah, yes, but life is never so simple. Many young women didn't choose this life freely. Families, especially noble ones, often sent their daughters to convents, not for piety, but for practicality. If there were too many daughters, and not enough land to inherit, a convent was cheaper than a dowry. Sister Juliana had dreams. She loved painting, and once she had kissed a boy behind a chapel wall back in her old village. She didn't forget that, and she wasn't alone. There's a fascinating record from 1347, in a convent in northern Italy. It speaks of immodest behavior between two sisters. The document, faded and delicate, describes how one sister was caught sleeping in another's bed. No punishments were mentioned, only that both were told to fast and pray for forgiveness. Quietly, the abbess chose not to inform the bishop. Why? Maybe she had done the same once. But let's not rush. Not every convent was a place of scandal. Some were filled with kindness, warmth, and even laughter. Imagine Sister Agnes, an elderly nun with soft eyes and the smell of cloves on her robes. She bakes bread every day. The kitchen is warm and dim. The oven crackles gently, and the air is full of steam and fresh dough. She hums a little tune while she kneads, something her mother taught her long ago. And, sometimes, she tells stories to the younger girls. She tells them how nuns used to dance. Yes, dance. Very slowly, during certain feast days, in the candlelight. holding hands. No one talks about that much anymore. And then there were the books. Many people think medieval nuns were cut off from knowledge, but actually, some convent libraries held beautiful manuscripts. Sister Beatrix spent her evenings copying ancient texts. She wore tiny glasses, her ink-stained fingers always moving gently, carefully. She knew Latin better than most priests in town. But among the psalms and sermons were poems, love poems, sometimes in French, sometimes in Old Occitan. She would pause, reread one line, then quietly smile. Sometimes silence holds more secrets than noise. And yet, not everything was peaceful. In 1382, in a convent near Cologne, a group of nuns refused to follow the abbess's rules. They began meeting late at night, in a small chamber above the dormitory. They read banned texts, laughed too loudly, and even shared sips of wine from a hidden flask. When discovered, they were separated, but the records show none were expelled. Perhaps the bishop knew it was better to let humans be human than to pretend perfection. Then there's the story of Sister Anne. She lived in England, in a windswept abbey by the sea. One night, during a storm, a young man washed ashore, a sailor, injured, pale, trembling. The nuns brought him in, wrapped him in warm blankets, gave him broth and oil for his wounds. Sister Anne was told to watch over him for 3 days. No one knows exactly what happened in that chamber, but the sailor stayed longer than needed. When he left, Sister Anne stopped speaking for weeks. One of the younger sisters later wrote, her eyes were the color of salt water, and her thoughts were far away. Now, this doesn't mean that all convents were places of longing or hidden feelings. Some truly were places of peace, but peace doesn't always mean perfection. Think of Sister Clara, sitting by the window, stitching a linen cloth. The sunlight falls across her hands, and she looks out at the garden. She sees the trees sway, birds hop between branches, and for a moment, she forgets she's wearing a habit. She remembers a warm summer day when she was sitting in a field, laughing with her brother. That memory stays with her, not in a painful way, but like a quiet stone in her pocket, something she turns over, gently, when the chapel is too silent. By now, you're starting to see, these stories aren't really scandals, not in the loud, terrible way we think of the word today. They are soft human moments, curled up in time, hidden in old parchment and silence, little sighs in the shadows. One more, before we let the candle burn low. In a convent near Prague, the abbess, Sister Lenora, had a secret room, behind the altar tucked behind tapestries. Inside were pages she had written, dozens of them, her thoughts, her doubts, her dreams, not confessions, not theology, just quiet wonderings. Does God feel the wind? She wrote once. If I were born a boy, would I still feel love when I touch the earth after rain? When she died, those pages were found. The bishop ordered them burned, but one page survived. It was used to wrap herbs in the infirmary, and a young novice read it before it was thrown into the fire. She never forgot it, and maybe that's why we still know these things at all. The quiet doesn't keep everything. Sometimes it leaves whispers behind. I think that's enough for tonight. The stone walls are cool, and the candle's almost gone. But the story still has a lot more to tell. The convent's candlelight flickers softly against the old stone. It's night now, and Sister Marie is brushing dust from the corners of the altar. It's quiet, even the owls outside seem to rest. But inside, the stories continue. Let's go deeper. Sister Marie has been here for 8 years now. She rarely speaks of her life before. Only once did she whisper about her family, how her older brother once carved her a little wooden rabbit. She keeps it in a pouch by her bed, hidden beneath a fold in her mattress straw. Sometimes in the dormitory, while everyone else is asleep, Marie lies awake, listening to the breathing of the other sisters. The quiet rhythm, like waves brushing the shore. But then, she hears something else. Laughed soft from down the hallway, near the infirmary. Now what's strange is, that hallway is supposed to be empty, but laughter, especially gentle, hidden laughter, has always lived in convent walls. And the truth is, Not all the rules were followed all the time. In fact, the rules themselves were sometimes written to cover up what was already being broken. Take, for example, the rule of Saint Benedict, followed in many convents. It called for silence, chastity, obedience. But in 1413, at a convent near Ghent, a young nun named Lucia was discovered with ink-stained sheets beneath her bed. She had been writing poetry about a knight she saw once when she was 13. She had never even spoken to him, but she imagined it all in her mind. Every night, over and over. She wasn't punished, not for the writing. She was punished for smiling when asked about it. That's the thing about rules in the Middle Ages. They were written in thick, straight lines. But humans, we walk in curves. There was a convent in Bavaria, somewhere around 1369, where the sisters made their own wine. It wasn't allowed, not really, but their abbess, an older woman with deep wrinkles and bright eyes, believed that a little joy helped the soul grow soft. She would bless the barrels quietly, and say God made grapes too, didn't he? Now, let's talk about a stranger case, one that feels almost like a dream. In the English countryside, around 1290, a nun named Sister Margaret began speaking in her sleep. Not just murmurs, but full sentences. In Latin, sometimes in French, once in Greek. The sisters thought she was possessed, but the local priest said, no, she had read too many books. You see, Margaret was the convent's librarian, and she didn't just read the Bible. She read old Roman myths, strange tales of goddesses, and even a manuscript called De Secretis Mulierum, the secrets of women. She knew things no woman outside the convent was supposed to know. One night, she whispered something in her sleep that made the other sisters shiver. She said, the flesh remembers what the soul forgets. They moved her to a private cell after that, but Margaret didn't mind. She said the silence helped her think more clearly, and in her final days, she asked to be buried, not beneath the chapel, but under the apple tree in the garden. The abbess agreed. Now, let's go even further back to 1107, to a convent in southern Spain, near Córdoba. This convent had an unusual rule. The sisters were allowed to speak freely after compline, the final prayer of the day. And oh, what they spoke of. There are surviving notes from one of the sisters, Sister Elvira, who kept a small hidden journal. In it, she wrote, tonight, Sister Tessa told me of the smell of cinnamon from the merchant she saw before she took her vows. She said she still dreams of it, and when she smells the spice during winter, she feels his hand on hers. These are not wild confessions, not even sins really, just memories that never left. Sometimes the deepest stories aren't what people did, but what they didn't do, what they still thought about while staring at the garden in the morning mist. Now, here's something even calmer. Have you ever wondered what the bedrooms of nuns looked like? Not cold prison cells. Not always. Each nun had her own little space, called a cell, but don't let the name fool you. There was often a small window, just big enough to see the garden or sky. The bed was straw, yes, but neatly made. A wooden chest for personal things. Sometimes a candle holder made of iron. And a tiny cloth, embroidered, with something personal, maybe her family's crest, or a flower she loved. Sister Hedwig, in a convent near the Rhine, kept a pine cone on her shelf. No one knew why. She never told anyone. She just smiled when asked. Let's go to Italy again. To a convent near Florence, 1471. There was a scandal. Yes, but not of the flesh. A nun had painted. That's all, but the church didn't like it. The image was of the Virgin Mary, with soft eyes, but her robe was slightly open at the neck. Too human, too real. The nun, Sister Caterina, was told to burn the painting. She did, but later that night, she painted again, not on canvas, on the inside of her wooden door, in egg tempera, with ash and soot and crushed berries. The image lasted until the convent was abandoned in the 18th century. A traveler saw it, and wrote, "The eyes seemed to follow me, but they weren't angry, just tired." There's something so human, so peaceful, in knowing that even in places where silence ruled, the mind never truly stopped dreaming. Even nuns, in all their devotion, remembered the smell of fresh bread, or the curve of a shoulder seen once at a market. A touch never felt, a kiss never given. There's even a story of a convent dog, Sister Lucia, not the poet, a different one, took in a puppy from the road. She named him Gabriel. The convent rules said no animals, but the abbess let it slide. Gabriel would sit during prayers, tail wagging, and at night, he slept in the laundry room, curled against the warm stone wall. One winter, when the firewood ran low, Sister Lucia gave up her blanket for him. She said, God gave us warmth to share. Gabriel lived for 9 years, and when he died, the sisters buried him behind the rose bushes. They held a little service. They didn't tell the bishop. Now, dear listener, it's getting late in our tale, but the candles still burn softly in some corners. There is one last whisper we should visit tonight. In a convent deep in the Alps, during a snowy winter, a nun named Magdalena carved poems into the underside of her windowsill. Using the tip of a spoon, the words were simple: I dream with open eyes, and sleep with a full heart. No one noticed the carvings until decades later, when the building was repaired after a storm. They were faded, but still there, still soft, still waiting to be read by someone, anyone, who needed them. Maybe that's what all these quiet stories are, not scandals, just soft truths, hidden behind robes and rituals, waiting for the world to fall asleep enough to listen. We're not done yet, but maybe, for now, we let the night grow deeper, and the stones hold their breath. The snow hasn't melted yet, not in the hills, and not from the windowsill where Magdalena once carved her tiny poems. But the convent, the convent continues to breathe, like an old cathedral bell, still swinging gently long after the clapper stops. Tonight we walk slowly, along the stone hallways, tracing the past with bare fingers, and soft thoughts. Let's drift, south now, to a quiet convent near Avignon. Sometime in the late 1300s, this one was known not for its scandals, but for its music. Each evening, after Vespers, the sisters would hum, just hum. No instruments, no lyrics, just breath turned into melody. It was never written down, but a wandering monk once described it as the sound of snow melting on warm stone. And that's how the sisters prayed, not with words, but with vibrations, with closeness, with warmth. But of course, not all was pure. There was one sister, Sister Aline, who always sang a little louder than the rest. She had once been a court singer, and her voice could make even the stiffest bishop blink with tears. And sometimes, just sometimes, she would slip in melodies from old folk songs. One night, she sang a tune so sweet, so tender, that another sister, Colette, wept quietly into her veil. Later, they were found sitting too close together in the kitchen, by the candlelight. Nothing happened, nothing anyone could see. But from that day forward, their cells were placed on opposite ends of the convent. Colette never hummed again. Even in silence, love tries to speak. Now, let's step away from France. We float eastward, to Poland. It's 4035, the wind is sharp there, and the convent walls are thick with old moss and frozen ivy. Inside, a young novice, just 14, named Aniela, is learning to read Latin, but she's not reading the Psalms today. She's found something else in the library, a small, thin book, tucked behind the sermon scrolls. It's handwritten, and it's not signed, but it's filled with little stories about women, queens, peasants, even mythical goddesses. And in the margins, tiny drawings, a woman with a bird on her shoulder, a naked figure with wings, a tree shaped like a woman's body. Strange, and quiet, and magical. Aniela reads it by candlelight, covering the pages quickly when she hears footsteps. She never tells anyone, but later in life, when she becomes abbess, she commissions a new garden, and at its center, she plants a single olive tree, rare for Poland. Underneath it, she buries that little book, wrapped in linen. She says it belonged to a sister who dreamed with her eyes open. Now, let's stay in the garden just a little longer. Gardens were the secret soul of medieval convents. Outside, the world burned and fought and bled. But inside these gardens, the sisters grew lavender, sage, fennel, marigold, not just for food or medicine, but because each plant had its own meaning. Lavender for grace, fennel for strength, roses. Well, roses meant too many things to name. There's a letter found from a nun in Verona, dated 1452. She writes, "Today I wept over a rose, not because it bloomed, but because it bloomed alone." So many of their emotions were placed into objects: a carved spoon, a painted wall, a flower bed. Because they couldn't always speak their hearts, they grew them instead. Let's visit one more story. In a convent tucked between the hills of Burgundy, the sisters had a special ritual on the first snowfall. They would gather in the courtyard, barefoot. Yes, barefoot. They would stand quietly until the first snowflake landed on their skin. Then, one by one, they would step forward and say one word. Just one. It could be anything: hope, father, bread, alone, whatever was living in their hearts. Then they'd go back inside. No one wrote down what anyone said. But one winter, Sister Marguerite said Thomas. No one knew who Thomas was. No one asked. But that night, she left a pair of men's gloves in the chapel pew. She never explained. She never had to. It's interesting. So many of these so-called scandals are not really about flesh or broken vows. They're about memory, desire that didn't know where else to live. Sister Eleonora, in a convent by the coast, once wrote a prayer that began like this: "Lord, take my hands, but let me keep my memories." She wasn't punished for it, but her writing desk was moved to the main hall, where others could watch her. She never wrote again. And what about letters? Yes, letters. Some nuns, especially in more liberal convents, were allowed to write to family, and sometimes to men, courtiers, priests, distant friends. Of course, the letters were read by the abbess before being sent, but clever minds found clever ways. One letter from Sister Clara included the line, "I still dream of the river that ran behind our house. I wonder if it's as cold now as it was when we were children." The recipient, a former knight, no blood relation, just a boy she'd known when she was 12. Another letter, this one from a convent in Belgium, ends with the words, "Do not worry, I am faithful. Only my shadow wanders." What does that mean? Did her body stay, but her heart drift? There's even record of one nun who married a monk. Not legally, not publicly, but privately. They would meet in the woods behind their respective monasteries and exchange handmade tokens. She gave him a linen scrap with her name stitched in purple thread. He gave her a carved piece of bone in the shape of a dove. They buried both under a tree and never spoke of it again. They remained in their orders until death. But when she died, he left the monastery, walked into the forest, and was never seen again. Not all convents were cloisters of sorrow or romance, though. Some were simply peaceful, quiet, like the convent of St. Dimphna in the Netherlands. The nuns there were mostly older women, widows, or mothers whose children had grown. They spent their days embroidering. One woman, Sister Bruna, embroidered stories. Not just patterns, but scenes. A woman walking through fire. A hand reaching for a key. Two faces, turned away from each other, but holding the same rose. When asked what they meant, she said, "Things I've seen, and things I've hoped." That's the thing about convent life. Not everyone lived in scandal, but everyone lived with something they never told. We'll rest here tonight, but the candles are still warm. The walls still hold their breath, and if you listen very carefully, you might still hear Sister Aline's humming in the quiet hours before dawn. She always ended with the same 3 notes, like a lullaby, for secrets, for longing, for peace. If you're still with me, we'll continue soon, but for now, sleep gently. The doors were never really locked. Not in the way people think. They creaked, softly, gently, as if they knew that not everything inside wanted to stay. and not everything outside wanted to intrude. And so tonight, we gently push open another. The air is a little warmer here, somewhere near Valencia, Spain. This convent was smaller than most, just 8 sisters, and a single garden, of thyme and oranges. The abbess was known to smile, not often, but enough to make it noticeable. She believed in confession, but not always aloud. Instead, she gave each nun a box, a plain wooden one, with a lock. She told them, "You may place your thoughts here. Every month, you may burn them, or keep them." And so, some wrote, some drew. One filled hers with lavender petals, and a single feather, nothing else. No one knew why, no one asked. One sister, Isadora, never used hers, at least, not at first. She said, "If God wishes to know my secrets, he will not need a key." But, one spring morning, she was seen carrying her box to the chapel, holding it like a sleeping bird. Later that day, the chapel smelled faintly of honey and smoke. No one ever spoke of it again. Sometimes, healing came not through rules, but rituals. Like Sister Regina, she was quiet, her hands always shaking. No one knew why she entered the convent. Some said she was once married to a lord who vanished in battle. Others whispered that she had lost a child. She never said, but every night she walked the same path in the garden. 5 steps forward, 2 steps to the left, kneel, stand, repeat, over and over, until her knees were raw, not from prayer, but from remembering. The others watched from their windows, unsure whether to feel sorrow or awe. On one especially quiet night, she left a tiny piece of fabric on the chapel door. It read, "He had blue eyes." That was all. She never walked the garden again. Now, let's float north, to a convent built beside a frozen lake in what is now modern-day Sweden. The winters there were long. Darkness swallowed most of the day. So, the sisters began to light small lamps. Not just in the halls, but in each other's rooms. Every morning, before sunrise, one sister would rise, light her own lamp, then quietly, gently, walk to another's cell and light hers. And then another, and another, until the entire convent glowed, like a low, steady heartbeat. It became a symbol. Even when you are alone, someone will bring light. Beautiful, right? But one year, one lamp was never lit. Sister Elske's. She had grown ill, silent, withdrawn. When asked if she wanted her lamp lit, she shook her head. "No," she said, "let me learn to love the dark." And so, they honored her wish. Her lamp stayed cold. But outside her door, every morning, someone placed a single pine needle. No one ever admitted who, but it happened, every day, until spring. And even after she passed, the needles still came. Sometimes the deepest feelings weren't even between lovers, but between sisters. Not nuns, but actual sisters. 2 blood sisters, Emma and Lucia, entered a convent together after their father died in a fire. Emma was older, Lucia, barely 12. They were inseparable. They slept side by side, read aloud to each other. When Emma caught fever, Lucia begged to be allowed to stay in the infirmary. She fed her, cleaned her hands, read her psalms through tears. When Emma passed, Lucia didn't speak for 3 weeks. When she finally did, her first words were, "Tell her I remembered to brush her hair." She never left the convent, and every year on the day of Emma's death, she laid out 2 pairs of shoes outside her cell, one small, one smaller. Sometimes grief is a kind of prayer too. Not all sadness was silent. In a convent just outside of Milan, one nun, Sister Agnes, was known for laughing too loud. She laughed during meals, during washing, even during evening prayers. Once, the abbess scolded her, but the others loved her. She told stories about when she was a child, and used to chase geese barefoot. About how she once thought angels had feathers like ducks. About how, when she was 16, a boy gave her a walnut, with a heart carved into it. She kept that walnut for 20 years, until one day, she buried it under the olive tree in the courtyard. Later, she was seen standing there, humming softly, eyes closed. When asked what she was humming, she said, something I only remember when I'm sad. There was tenderness too. In the convent kitchens, where bread was made not just to eat, but to share, Sister Fiona always made extra loaves, little ones. She'd wrap them in cloth and leave them in corners of the town. During winter, she called them whispers of warmth. One winter, the bishop visited and asked about the missing flour. She didn't lie. She just said, "Cold hands pray louder." The bishop didn't understand, but he said nothing more. And what of the walls themselves? Did you know, in some convents, the walls were filled with little holes? Tiny one, not for spying, but for whispering. Some historians believe they were for confessions. Others say they were for secrets. Two nuns, separated by vows or duty, could kneel on either side and speak without being seen. One confession found in the records says simply, "I have loved, and I do not regret it." No name, no punishment listed, just a silence, followed by the word Amen. The church was strict, yes, but the human heart, it finds its way, always. And what of dreams? Many nuns recorded their dreams. Sister Ottilie had a dream journal filled with drawings. One showed a staircase reaching into the clouds, with a fox at the bottom. Another had a woman in red robes, feeding honey to a lion. No one ever explained them, but she said she always woke up, feeling less alone. Dreams were sacred after all. In places where voices were quiet, dreams shouted. Sister Beatrice once told another nun, "In my dreams I sing, and no one tells me to stop." We're nearing the final candle tonight. Let's visit one more story before rest. This one, hidden deep in a Scottish convent, where one nun, Sister Isla, refused to take vows. She lived there, worked, prayed, but never completed the ceremony. When asked why, she said, "Because my promise is already made." To whom? They asked. She just smiled. But once a year, on the night of the first frost, she lit 12 candles in a perfect circle and sat in the center. No one dared ask why. But one year, a traveling friar stopped by, and upon seeing the circle, quietly removed his boots and walked barefoot across the stone, joining her in silence. They didn't speak, not then, not ever. But when he left, she whispered, "Still true." Then she blew out the candles, all at once. There are more stories, always more. But tonight, we'll rest here, beneath the flickering quiet of memory. Tomorrow, we'll walk again. But for now, let's sleep like the candles after Vespers. Soft, still, and full of warmth. High again. So far, we've wandered through the gardens of quiet love, the shadows of silent grief, the hallways lit by soft rebellion. And yet, there's still more, always more. Because what makes these stories so deeply calming is how they never rushed. Just like tonight, we're taking another step, this time, into a convent nestled between the hills of northern Burgundy. This place was unusual, not because of its architecture, but because of what the sisters believed. They believed in music, not just as hymns, but as healing. They sang to the fields, to the bread, to the water, even to each other's wounds. Whenever someone was sick, Sister Marguerite would sing to their feet, quiet little lullabies in Latin. Somnus veni, corpus leni. It meant something like, "Sleep come, body soften." The others started doing it too, and over time, every cell had a lullaby. Even the stones felt calmer. But this place was also home to one of the most quietly scandalous figures in any convent record, Sister Lenore. Yes, she was once the daughter of a nobleman, rich, powerful, well-connected, but she gave it all up for a habit and a simple bed of straw. Or so it seemed, because Sister Lenore kept something hidden, a mirror, polished silver, framed in carved ivory. No one knew how she kept it, and yet, every week, she would take it out beneath the moonlight and just look at herself, not in vanity, but in something else, something gentle. When asked why, she once whispered, "Because I refuse to forget that I was made in beauty." And That's not easy in a world that often punished women for remembering they were more than silent prayer. But Leonore's mirror was not her only quiet rebellion. She also wrote poetry, hidden in the margins of her psalter. Lines like, "God made me from stars and mud, but men only ever saw the mud," or, "My skin remembers the kiss of the sun, though I wear wool in his name." One day, a visiting monk found her writings, and reported her to the bishop, but when asked to hand over her psalter, she had already burned it, in the hearth, along with sprigs of rosemary and salt. The ashes were said to smell oddly sweet. No punishment was ever recorded. She lived peacefully, until her death at 63, with the mirror still tucked into her robe. And speaking of hidden things, let's go softly now, to a convent in what we now call Austria. There they had a hidden room. It wasn't in any map, not even the abbess spoke of it, but the sisters called it the breathing room. Why? Because, inside, there were no rules. You could cry. You could laugh. You could sleep, scream, sing, or sit in silence. Only one nun at a time could enter. And no one was ever asked what they did inside. There were candles, a small pillow, and a bell. When you were done, you rang the bell, and left. They say the abbess herself visited it, every Thursday night. But not everything was soft. There were moments of, strange desire too. Nothing evil, nothing cruel, just deeply, deeply human. Sister Anne, for instance, was once seen touching a statue, not in worship, but with longing. She brushed the hand of a carved angel, as if it could feel. She whispered to it. She placed wild flowers in its palms. Later she was asked about it. She smiled, and said only, "He never tells me no." Long pause followed that, but no one ever moved the statue. They simply let her be. In another convent, in Sicily, there was a small pond in the orchard. Just a round patch of still water, but the sisters said it could listen. They called it the quiet mirror. Sometimes, a nun would kneel beside it, and speak secrets. Never to another soul, just the water. One novice, Sister Caterina, admitted she once told the pond she loved another sister. When asked why she would do that, she said, so that someone, even if only the water, would know. Later that year, that same sister left the convent. No explanation, but the pond remained, still, listening. Let's drift now, to Ireland. Windy cliffs, a sea-gray sky, and a convent perched like a watchtower over the coast. This one was home to Sister Moira. She was odd. She walked barefoot, even in winter. She never wore her veil properly, and she hummed lullabies from her childhood. Not Latin chants. One night, during a storm, a fisherman washed ashore unconscious. The sisters pulled him in. Moira sat beside him for 3 days. Didn't speak, didn't sleep. When he woke, he wept. Not because of pain, but because, as he said, she made me dream of war. They say he returned to the sea, but wrote letters to the convent every year. Always addressed simply to the girl with bare feet. Moira never answered, but she kept every letter wrapped in wool beneath her bed. Sometimes what looked like scandal was just aching kindness. There was a convent once that baked a special kind of bread, dense, round, sweetened with figs. They only made it once a year, on the feast of Saint Cecilia. Why? Because Sister Hellas had once tasted fig bread at her wedding. A wedding she never wanted. She was sent to the convent after her husband died suddenly in war. She spoke little, but every year on that feast, the sisters let her bake. She didn't speak while she did it, but her hands moved like memory, and when asked why it mattered, she simply said, "Because I deserve to taste something soft again." Even the most faithful hearts sometimes ache for gentleness. Even in the holiest walls, desire tiptoes in, not just for flesh, but for touch, for kindness, for memory, and yes, sometimes for love. Let's pause now. Think of Sister Clarice, who once said, "I will die having never kissed anyone, but I have loved more than most." And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Our candles are flickering lower tonight, but our warmth is growing deeper. There are still many stories left, whispers waiting in stone, sighs trapped in parchment. But for now, let's settle back. Let our breath match the quiet rhythm of worn stone floors and soft-spoken prayers. We'll continue again soon. If you're still awake, that's beautiful. But if you're asleep, then you're right where you should be. So, where were we? Ah, yes. Sister Clarissa's quiet confession still echoing. I will die having never kissed anyone. But I have loved more than most. What a thing to say, right? So simple. And yet, it holds so much weight, and as that soft thought fades, tonight, let's begin again, gently. There was a convent in what is now southern France, hidden in the fog-kissed fields, just outside Toulouse. This place felt more like a cottage than a church. Everything was small, quiet, intimate. The nuns there, they weren't known for scandal, but for softness, soft words, soft bread, soft touches on tired shoulders. One of them, Sister Isabeau, had a secret that wasn't shameful. It was tender. She kept these, not in defiance, not hidden, but not entirely permitted either. The church didn't like these kept near the cloister, but Isabeau did it anyway, because she believed that the hum of the hive matched the rhythm of prayer. She used to say, "Listen close enough, and the bees say amen." No one ever stopped her. In fact, when she passed, the sisters buried her with a small vial of honey, tucked inside her sleeve, and every year after, they drizzled honey on the altar, just once, on her birthday, just because. Let's go somewhere colder now, a monastery near the edges of what we'd now call the Swiss Alps. But this wasn't a typical monastery. It had a small annex of sisters. Unusual, but not unheard of. They worked with wool, spinning, weaving, washing. But Sister Agnes, she died, and what she died was never just wool. She would add things like crushed berries, dried violets, even ash. No one knew her formulas, but the cloaks and cloths she made, they shimmered, faintly, just enough to make people pause. One visiting priest once said her fabrics looked like they remembered a dream, and Sister Agnes, she just smiled. No one knew this, but, in one batch of deep plum fabric, she had soaked a love letter, from before she joined the order. She didn't burn it, didn't rip it, she just let the ink dissolve into the dye, and then, she made altar cloth with it. And no one ever knew, but some said, the priest always looked a little more emotional when Mass was served over it. Oh. And while we're on the topic of secret touches, there was another place, deep in Tuscany, a convent known for silence. Not just quiet, but deep intentional silence. They practiced what they called sacred muteness. Some sisters didn't speak at all for years, but one, Sister Etta, she found her own language. She embroidered words. One robe had the Latin for "I miss my mother" stitched under the sleeve. Another had a quote from a love poem, sewn beneath the hem. When someone once found a stitch that read, "You were beautiful," and asked her about it, she only nodded, and then offered tea. No explanation, no apology. Sometimes the most meaningful things are said in thread. Now, across the sea, let's drift across it gently. Yep, to a convent near York, England. And here, a sister had a secret library, not of scripture, but of forbidden writings. Not dangerous ones. Just, unapproved poems, herbal journals, old Roman histories, even letters. Lots of letters, love letters, goodbye letters, apologies. She copied them all by hand, and hid them in hollowed bricks. She called it the Wall of Want. No one discovered it during her life, but during a renovation in the 1800s, the workers found dozens of fragile papers, pressed flat behind the chapel's northern wall. One simply read, "To touch you once more, I would become a sinner again." Another, "If heaven means forgetting your face, then may I never enter." Still with me, then come with me to a convent near Prague. Here, the sisters believed in dreams. Every morning, they would share their dreams with each other over oat broth. Not to interpret them, just to remember them. One dream, passed down from Sister Melina, was said to be prophetic. In it, she wandered a garden made entirely of glass. Every flower, a sculpture, every tree, clear. She said she heard music made of light. And a voice told her, beauty can be worship. The other sisters, they didn't scold her. They just asked her to draw it. She did, on parchment, with charcoal and egg yolk. The drawing still exists, hung in a museum in Brno, titled only, I Listened. And now, let's return gently to a convent, tucked into the rolling green hills of the Low Countries. It had a tradition. On every winter solstice, the youngest nun would tell a story, not from scripture, but from memory. She would sit near the hearth, the others would sip warm wine or clove tea, and for just one night, the rules didn't apply. They could laugh, they could sigh, they could remember. And the stories, they were about life before the habit. One year, Sister Berth told the tale of kissing a baker's son in the snow. Another, Sister Maud confessed she used to dance barefoot in taverns. No one judged. In fact, they smiled, because the silence of the habit didn't erase who they'd been. It held it, like warm stone holds sun after dark. And maybe, that's what these so-called scandals really are. Not sins, not shame, just memory, refusing to die quietly. So we'll keep listening, and you, just rest, sink, soften, let your thoughts float like ash in warm candlelight, and we'll continue, again, when the stillness calls for it. If you're still with me, gently, slowly, let your breath match mine. In, hold, out, there you go. Good. Last time, we wandered through quiet dreams, whispered stories, glass gardens, honey altars. Tonight, it gets even softer. Not darker, no, but deeper. Let's return to the edge of the Alps. Same region, different season. Long after Sister Agnes's shimmering cloths had faded, there was a new sister. Her name was Ariel. Ariel was quiet, but not the kind of quiet you think. She didn't avoid conversation. She listened too well, too deeply. People used to say she could hear a lie in a prayer, just by how you breathed. She never punished anyone, never even told the priest. She just baked them bread, warm, soft, with honey folded in, as if to say, I heard you, I forgive you. But Ariel had her own secret, not scandalous, just beautifully human. She was in love with a voice. Yes, just a voice. Each month a monk from the nearby monastery would send written sermons to be copied. But once, he sent a recording. Not on tape, of course. That didn't exist then. He sent it on wax. A rare thing. A precious gift. And Ariel, oh, she played it only at night. After Compline, she'd sit alone by the tiny wooden player, light a single candle, and listen to his voice recite the Psalms. She never saw his face, never knew his age. She just loved the way he pronounced grace. She once told another nun, if I die before the wax wears out, bury it with me. And they did. That wax cylinder was placed beneath her hands, wrapped in linen, still smelling faintly of beeswax and rosemary. Let's drift now, southward, to Sicily, a quiet coastal convent, with views of the sea but no windows facing it. That was intentional. The abbess believed the sea stirred lust. Too powerful, too moving. But Sister Callista, she found a way. She washed linens, and sometimes she lingered at the back, where the water barrels stood. From that angle, if you tilted just so, the sea peeked through the olive trees. Callista wrote poems to the ocean. Lines like, I've never tasted salt but your voice is brined. You rock me without touching. One of her poems was found scribbled inside a hollowed-out soapstone, tucked beneath the laundry basin, and it ended with, if you were a man, I'd have sinned. If you were a god, I'd have worshipped. But because you are water, I only weep, like silk floating in sleep. Now, onward we float, to Germany. A Benedictine house, with strict rules. No music. None. Not even humming. But Sister Lena?
Oh, she hummed.
Only in her garden. very, very softly. And not songs, just tones. She claimed it helped the violets grow straighter. When the Mother Superior found out, she was told to stop. She did, for 3 weeks. But then, she started again. And one day, she was caught, again. But this time, the abbess didn't scold. She cried. Turns out, the song Lena was humming was the lullaby the abbess's mother used to sing. How could Lena have known? No one knows. Maybe some things travel in the soil, or through silence, like seeds hidden in stone. We're not done yet, because somewhere in Flanders, in a convent almost completely forgotten now, a sister had a forbidden painting. Not of sin, not of flesh, of light, just light. She painted it using egg yolk, crushed pearls and ash. She didn't show anyone. She hid it beneath her cot, but when she died, the sisters found it, wrapped in cloth that smelled of myrrh. The painting was so soft, so gentle, that no one could describe it. They tried. Words like dawn and hush were used, but none of them fit. The abbess, an older woman with a limp and a fondness for apples, placed it behind the altar. No name, no frame, just the painting. And for years after, the light in the chapel felt warmer, even on cloudy days. Sometimes, scandal isn't what they think it is. It's not fire or flesh. It's memory. It's music. It's a painting of nothing but feeling. Let me tell you one more. Then you can drift as far as you like. There was a small chapel in the Pyrenees, a mountain convent, cold, lonely, but known for its bells. Each nun had her own tone struck at dawn and dusk. One sister, Sabine, had a tone so low it sounded like thunder wrapped in velvet. She would ring it slow, slow, once, twice, only twice, every morning, until one day, she rang it 3 times, just once, just once. No one said anything, but from then on, every sister rang 3 times on their birthday, even after Sabine passed, and her bell. They buried it with her, not underground, but in the chapel wall, facing east, toward the sun. So now, as your breath softens, and your eyes flutter, let these stories hum in your mind, like Sister Ave's bees. Let your limbs grow heavy like wax melting by the hearth. And know this, these scandals weren't fire, they were warmth, just warmth. Soft rebellions, small songs, gentle heresies, wrapped in habit and hush. Sleep, if you wish. So, we return to soft stones and slow bells, to the quietest places where the loudest longings once breathed. Tonight, we're going to follow someone different. Not a nun, not a monk, but a scribe. His name was Brother Emmerich. Now, wait, why are we talking about him in a story about nuns? Because he was the reason Sister Beatrice learned how to write, and that changed everything. Emmerich came from the hills near Rouen. He had soft hands, always ink-stained, and a gaze that made people feel heard. When he was sent to a nearby convent to copy legal documents, the abbess offered him a side room, and in return, he offered lessons, just quiet ones, only for the most trusted sisters. Sister Beatrice was curious, not rebellious. She just wanted to write her own name. So she asked him. He agreed, but only if she brought her own parchment. So she stitched it herself, from scraps of unused linen and goat hide. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't white, but she called it her sky, because the first word she ever wrote on it was above. Not Beatrice, not Amen. Just above. No one ever asked her why. The thing is, once she learned to write, she couldn't stop. She wrote prayers, then recipes, then dreams, and once, a poem, a very short one. But it was, how do we say this? It was suggestive, not lewd, not crude, just full of wanting. It went something like this. If I were linen, I'd cling. If I were wine, I'd stain. But I am breath, so I wait. Warm invisible, again. She folded that poem into her psalter, thinking no one would ever find it. But one night, during a candle check, the abbess found it by accident. She read it twice, then said nothing, just placed it back gently, and the next morning, left Beatrice a better quill. These were the kinds of scandals that never made it into history books, because they weren't really sins, just sighs turned into sentences. Around that same time, in the hills near Toulouse, another sister was having different thoughts. Sister Marin. She wasn't interested in words. She was interested in scents, perfumes, balms, oils. She believed the soul had a fragrance, each one different, and she tried to bottle them. She started with flowers, violets, mostly, then lavender, then herbs, not for healing, no, but for memory. She once said to a friend, "If I miss someone, I make their scent." One scent in particular was never named, just labeled, "As." No one knows who it was for, but she used to sit by the window with it, closed her eyes, and just breathe it in. She never spoke when she did this. Once a month, always on the 13th. You might wonder, were these sins? Were these scandals? Let's go even quieter. Let's float to another place. In northern Italy, a convent had a library, very small, but special, because one of the sisters, old, nearly blind, had memorized every title. She couldn't read anymore, but she remembered. She would sit in the middle of the room and recite aloud what she could recall. Not the books themselves, but the feelings of reading them. She once said, "Some books feel like snow, some like honey, some like dusk, some like skin." That last one made some of the younger nuns giggle, but she never laughed, just smiled a little. She knew what she was doing. Now, furry. One last story for this night. Far north, a convent in the Isles, surrounded by mists and moss. The sisters there were isolated. No visitors, but once, a fisherman washed ashore, injured, barely breathing. They took him in, against the rules. Sister Eleanor was the one who nursed him, and she never said a word to him. Not once, but every morning, she left something at the foot of his bed. A shell, a smooth stone, a sprig of thyme. He stayed for 7 days. He never spoke either. When he left, he carved something into a piece of driftwood, and left it on her chair. It said, "I did not speak, because I did not wish to make you stay." She kept that piece of wood for the rest of her life, and when she died, it was placed in her hands. Some say, her fingers curled around it, even after death. Let's breathe now, deeply, gently. Let the silence grow mossy. Let your body fall into stillness, like an old library wrapped in velvet dusk. And remember, these so-called scandals weren't chaos. They were the little rebellions of the soul, the whispers between silence and breath, between devotion and desire, and perhaps, the truest prayers ever offered. We're back inside those stone walls again. Cold, mossy, but not unkind. Tonight, we drift not through ink or herbs, but through something even softer, something stitched. Yes, habits, the clothing of nuns. But what you probably never heard was that the stitching of habits often held more secrets than the pages of their prayers. Let's start with Sister Ada. She lived near the Black Forest. She wasn't known for singing, or silence, or sweetness. She was known for her hymns. Yes, her hymns, because inside them she stitched tiny messages. Not full letters, not words really, just shapes. A leaf, a bird, a sun. Some say they were prayers, others say memories. But Sister Ada never explained. She just kept sewing and humming, a tune no one ever recognized. One day, a curious novice tried to copy her style, but when she tried to stitch the little symbols, the thread wouldn't lie flat, the cloth wrinkled, the needle stuck. Sister Ada smiled and said, "It only works if you sew with ache." The novice didn't understand, but she never tried again. Elsewhere, at a convent in the Highlands, the abbess herself had an unusual practice. She would bless the new habits, but then, after the ceremony, she would gather a few older nuns and ask them to gently pull a single thread loose from the inside seam. Just one. Not enough to damage it, but enough to remind them, "Nothing we wear is perfect," she'd whisper. "Not even our holiness." She believed that little thread invisible from the outside was a mark of humility. But, some of the sisters began to see it differently. Some saw it as freedom, so they began tying that loose thread into a knot, and placing a drop of lavender oil on it. Tiny acts of beauty, hidden, soft, but real. Now, here's where it gets a little more curious. Have you ever heard of the blue habit? Probably not. Because it was forbidden. It was a robe dyed deep, dusky blue, not black, not white. Blue, like a late sky before a storm. Only one convent ever made them. It was in the hills of France, near Avignon. It's said that those habits were made from linen soaked in crushed wood and rose ash. Each one took months to create, and they were only worn at night. Not for rituals, not for prayer, but for dreaming. The sisters would wear them during something they called silent stretches. Times where they would lie in their rooms, windows open, and just think, or sleep. No talking, no moving, just being. The abbess believed that dreams were part of God's voice, and blue, she said, was the color of listening. There was one sister there, named Margot. She kept a dream journal hidden in her mattress stuffing. She only wrote one sentence per dream. Here are some of them. "I walked through a door and became air. My hands were feathers but couldn't fly. He had no face but smelled of oranges. I married a star and burned my veil. There were no sins, only songs." She never shared them with anyone, but when she died the other sisters found the scraps, and instead of burning them, they stitched them into the lining of their blue habits. That's how secrets stayed alive. In fabric, not fire. Let's glide now, to Italy again, to a sister named Lucia. Lucia. She didn't write, she didn't sew, she danced, only alone, only in her room, only after Compline, when all the others had gone quiet. And here's the strange part. No one ever saw her, but they heard the floorboards creak, softly, not like someone pacing, but like someone twirling, like someone saying with her body what she couldn't with her voice. One evening, a candle was left outside her door on accident, and its flicker cast her shadow onto the wall. 3 nuns saw it. They didn't knock. They didn't speak. They just watched. And the next night, they came again. Then more followed. Until 5, 6, sometimes 8 sisters would sit silently in the hallway, watching her silhouette move in circles, gentle, slow, like leaves on a pond. Lucia never acknowledged them. But once, she slid a note under the door. It said, "If you are watching, please breathe with me." And so they did. Every night. For years. Eventually, they stopped calling her sister Lucia. They called her the Evening Whisper. Back in England, something different was happening. One convent had its own embroidery guild. The nuns made altar cloths, banners, and sometimes veils for nobility. But they also made secret gifts for each other. A stitched leaf, a hidden heart, tiny initials inside sleeves. Not romantic, necessarily, but tender, very tender. One sister made a pillow for her friend's aching back. She filled it with down and a sprig of rosemary. The note sewn inside, "For your spine and your sorrow," not scandalous, but so intimate. Like a whisper that never needed to be loud to be heard. Let's slow down here, just a little. You see, we've wandered far from the idea of sin, haven't we? But in truth, these little moments, they were the scandals, because they defied the silence. They made emotion visible. They turned obedience into softness. And sometimes, softness was more dangerous than shouting, because it lingered, and people remembered, even after the stones crumbled, even after the names faded. A thread, a shadow, a sentence, that's all it takes to stay alive in history's dreams. Sleepy yet? If not, we'll keep going. There's more to share. There always is. The bell tower rings, but you can't hear it here. Only the soft creak of worn wood, and the hush of something older than memory. Tonight, we're not drifting through prayers or habits, but through ink. Not just scriptures or scrolls, but secret writings, hidden letters, forbidden poems. Yes, the writings of nuns. You see, many of these women could read and write when most of the world couldn't. It was a privilege and a prison, but some used it like a window. They didn't throw it open. They cracked it, just enough to let a little breeze through. A breeze of longing, curiosity, sometimes laughter. Let's start with Sister Helen. She lived in a French convent around the early 1200s. She was the scriptorium keeper. That means she watched over the place where books were copied by hand. Quiet, focused work, with lamps, and quills and ink that smelled like old rain. But Sister Helevese, she had a trick. She would sometimes write little things in the margins of the manuscripts. Not full sentences, just thoughts. Tiny, like pebbles. One said, "God sees everything, but I wonder, does he blink?" Another, "The abbess's cat watches me. I think he was a monk in a past life." And once, next to a long passage about sin, "Would God still love me if I slept through prayers?" Just soft, silly things, but they were real. Real like warm bread. Real like sun through a stained glass window. Not holy, just human. Her margin notes weren't discovered until the 1800s, when a scholar was studying the manuscript, and when he found them, he didn't know what to do, because they made him laugh, quietly, in a library full of silence. He called them the giggles of God. Further north, in Germany, a sister named Agnes wrote full poems, but not under her name. She used the name Feather, just that, Feather. Her poems weren't about saints or sacrifice. They were about color, about warmth. One poem simply described the feeling of stepping into sunlight after rain. "It kissed my shoulder like a mother, then ran down my arm like honey." Another was about a robin who visited her window every morning for 7 days. She wrote, "He did not sing, but he watched, and somehow, I felt cleaner." The poems were hidden in the covers of hymnals. No one found them, until decades later, when the bindings began to fray. You see, even forgotten paper finds a way to speak. Now, deeper still, let's go to Italy, to the city of Siena, a convent, where nuns were forbidden from writing anything without approval. But Sister Leonetta, oh, she didn't quite follow that rule. She kept what we now call a sigh book. Every night, she wrote one sentence, not about her day, but about what she felt. No explanation. Just the feeling. Here are a few. "Today I was a branch in wind. My chest is full of quiet lightning. The bread was warm. I wept. I do not miss the world. I miss the smell of oranges. God did not speak, but neither did he leave." She never showed it to anyone, but she hid it in the rafters, between beams. Wrapped in a shawl, the sigh book was found during repairs, centuries later. Still wrapped, still folded neatly, still weight. Some letters were not found in books, but in walls. Yes, in one convent in Bruges, they found letters hidden inside the plaster, tucked in during renovations or repairs. What did they say? Some were prayers, some were confessions, but some were love letters, not to men, not even always to women, just to feeling. One said, "When I saw her light her candle, my knees forgot the floor." Another, "I dreamt I kissed someone, but their face was mine. What does that mean?" And this one, perhaps the softest, "I have loved many things in silence, but this silence is louder than joy." Who wrote them? No one knows. And maybe that's the point. The names aren't needed. The feelings were the message. Let's rest here a moment. It's soft, isn't it? These words from centuries ago, written in ink that dried before your great-great-grandparents were born. And yet, they still feel warm, still make your heart tilt. Just a little. Not because they're loud, but because they're whisper. And sometimes a whisper travels farther than a shout. Back to England, there was a nun named Eleanor. She never learned to write words, but she learned to write numbers. She was the convent's bookkeeper. Her pages were full of lists, bread loaves, candles, wool, honey, but in the margins of every list, she drew a symbol. Always the same. A small bird, sitting on a perch. She said it was her way of saying I'm here. When asked why a bird, she replied, because birds are free, but they always come back to the nest. That little bird showed up in dozens of old account books. Even after Eleanor died, other sisters kept drawing it, because somehow it made them feel seen. So, what's the scandal? You might be wondering, none of this feels wild, none of it sounds sinful. But here's the thing, in a world where silence was the rule, writing feelings, even tiny ones, that was scandalous. Not with fire and brimstone, but with ink and breath and heartbeat. They weren't supposed to tell the truth of their hearts, but they did, and they did it with such softness that no one noticed. Until now. Still with me, that's good. We've walked through words tonight, past poems, and margins, and sighs. There's more, there's always more. But for now, let the ink fade a little, let the candle dim, we'll drift again soon. Just close your eyes, and let the pages turn themselves. Sirred, and let the pages turn themselves. So, sir, there was a hallway, long and narrow, in a small convent near Ghent. No windows, just the flickering glow of torchlight. Along its wall were paintings, strange little ones barely the size of your hand, no names on them. Just delicate faces with large eyes and curious expressions. They were nuns, painted by other nuns. You wouldn't expect art in a place like this, but it was, a quiet kind of rebellion. You see, drawing wasn't allowed in most convents. Images were to be sacred, approved, and copied exactly from older examples. But in this place, they painted each other, not as saints, not as Madonnas, just as they were, with crooked teeth, wrinkled hands, eyes that looked tired, or sometimes almost mischievous. One portrait was especially strange, a nun looking off to the side, with a subtle smirk and a blue smudge on her cheek. On the back of that painting, hidden beneath layers of glue, was a note: she always laughed when she prayed. They weren't supposed to make these, but they did anyway. And they called it the Gallery of Glances. It was their way of remembering each other, not in holiness, but in humanness. Not far from there, in another quiet cloister in eastern France, there was a hidden room, not locked, just forgotten. It was discovered by accident, during cleaning. Inside, a bed, a trunk, some threadbare books, and a diary. A nun named Mirabelle had lived there in the early 1300s. No one remembered her name, but her diary told a different story. It wasn't filled with deep thoughts, just small ones. She wrote about the way her knees hurt when it rained, about how she secretly loved the way the abbess whispered when she was angry, about how she once saw a frog in the chapel and decided it was a sign, though she never said of what. One entry read, "Today I am not sad, but I am also not joyful. I think I am soup." That was all. No context, no reason, just soup. Another entry, "Sister Lenore braided my hair. She says it looks like the wheat in August. I do not know what that means, but I think I liked it." She also wrote about dreams, a lot. One night she dreamed she was flying, not as an angel, but as herself, holding a loaf of bread like a baby. Another night, she dreamed the Virgin Mary told her she should try painting. So she did. And that's where it gets curious, because in the trunk next to her bed, beneath layers of fabric and crumbling parchment, were paintings. Small ones, mostly of animals, cats, geese, a very sleepy-looking goat, one of a fish with a crown. But then, one stood out. It was of a woman. No halo, no name. Just a peaceful face, eyes closed, hair unbound, sleeping. On the back, "This is me, if I were brave." You can almost feel her, can't you? All those centuries ago, painting in silence, just hoping someone might understand. There were other convents too, some where the rules bent like willow branches. In one such place, nuns were allowed to garden, and they did, lavishly, but some went further. They grew plants that weren't just for food or flowers. They grew herbs for remedies. Some nuns became so skilled, they were known as Green Sisters. They weren't just gardeners, they were quiet healers, and sometimes they used that healing in secret ways. There's a letter, written anonymously from a noblewoman thanking a convent for a quiet favor. No one knows what the favor was, but the letter ends with "You've saved a soul." And perhaps a life. Could it have been help with a pregnancy, or an illness hidden from others? No one knows, but the nuns kept no records, only roots, seeds, leaves tucked into books, and silence, always silence. Some of them brewed wine, others made cheese, and one convent in the Pyrenees, they had a secret recipe for perfume. Yes, perfume. It wasn't for luxury, it was for funerals, to mask the scent of decay in their little chapel when winter slowed burials. But some say, a few of the sisters wore a dab behind their ears anyway. One note in a recipe book said, "A small blessing for one's own nose." It's funny, isn't it? The little ways people try to keep themselves human, even behind walls, even in silence, even when they're told not to. Then there's the story of Sister Salandine. She was known for laughter, always smiling, always humming, even when she was sick. Even when she broke her leg and had to lie flat for weeks, she'd still hum, sometimes silly tunes, sometimes made-up songs with no words. The abbess warned her not to sing secular tunes anymore. So Celandine started humming in reverse. Yes, she learned how to hum the melody backwards. Just to be difficult, or playful, or maybe just to stay herself. One of the youngest sisters wrote, "She sounded like the wind learning to speak. It made the walls less lonely." She never wrote anything down. She didn't leave behind any books. But generations later, nuns in the same convent still remember her name because of her laughter. And that's a kind of legacy too, isn't it? Not carved in stone, but whispered through time. Are your eyes heavy yet? Is the weight of the candlelight pressing softly on your thoughts? Let it. You're safe here, among paintings with no signatures, laughter that echoed down long-gone halls, sisters who wrote poems on scraps and dreamed of birds. Let your breath match the rhythm of these old stories, soft, still, real. You see, behind the walls of those quiet convents, there were seasons, even when the world outside blurred by in war and famine and festivals. Inside, time moved slowly. The bells told them when to rise, when to pray, when to eat, when to sleep. But some nuns, they followed other rhythms too. Like the moon, there was one convent in the north, surrounded by thick forests and cool rivers, where the sisters quietly followed lunar cycles, not in a witchy way, not exactly, but in a calm observing kind of way, like gardeners do, or beekeepers. They watched how the moonlight made the chapel walls shimmer like silver. One sister wrote in her little journal, "I feel most peaceful when the moon is full. It makes the shadows more honest." There's something very quiet about that thought. And at night, they would sometimes gather, not for prayer but just to sit, to listen, to breathe. They didn't speak much, sometimes not at all. They would sit near the herb garden, wrapped in their cloaks, their breath rising like fog in the chilly air, and just look up. The stars didn't need translating. They didn't demand confession. They just were. Not all convents were so calm. Some were lively, like the one near Siena. That place had stories, not terrible ones, just spirited. The nuns there loved music, and somehow they got their hands on a small organ, a bit broken, not quite tuned, but it made sound, and that was enough. One sister could play it with her eyes closed. They weren't supposed to sing anything that wasn't liturgical, but they did. They sang folk songs from their childhood villages, songs about laundry, goats, one song about a boy who got lost in a bakery and never came out. They even made up their own songs. One popular one was just nonsense syllables, something like lira lira lia, da na da, nu. No meaning, just sound, but it made them giggle, and when the abbess walked by, they'd hum it more softly, pretending it was plain chant. She knew, of course, but she never said anything. She used to be young once too. And speaking of music, did you know some convents wrote entire plays? Little ones. Not grand theater. Just tiny productions. Two nuns would write dialogue. Another would make masks out of cloth and candle soot. There are records of one play, written in 1324, where Saint Cecilia is arguing with her cat about whether it's okay to eat bread on Fridays. And the cat speaks. Yes, a talking cat. The audience, just a few sisters and maybe a friendly monk visiting from town. They didn't do it for fame, just for fun. Something to break the sameness of silent meals and endless prayers. Sometimes joy was quiet rebellion. But not all stories stayed innocent. There were a few convents where things got complicated, especially when noble families used the convents as places to store daughters they didn't want to marry off. Imagine a 14-year-old girl, spirited, clever, born into wealth, suddenly sent away, veiled and expected to live a life of silence. Some accepted it, others didn't. There's the case of Sister Agnes of Navarre. She was noble, educated, sharp-tongued, and she never quite fit. She questioned everything. Why the prayers were in Latin, when they all spoke Aucassin. Why the convent roof leaked, and no one fixed it. Why some sisters got 2 eggs on feast days, and others just 1. She was always asking, always writing, always thinking. One day, she sent a letter to a bishop with 19 questions. 9 questions like, if Christ sat with sinners, why can't we speak to the baker who comes on Thursdays? The bishop didn't answer. But her sisters loved her. She made them laugh. She made them think. She also made them write. Under Agnes's influence, the nuns began recording things, not just prayers, but life. They made what historians later called the Book of Daily Rhythms. And inside it were pages like, today we had turnips. Sister Magdala did not smile. The candle in the chapel sputtered and went out. Sister Noel laughed and said, perhaps God is blinking. So simple, but so real. Those little notes, they were windows into minds that were often forgotten. Let's walk through one of those minds. Sister Alex. She was not known for joy, or rebellion, or beauty, or even skill. She was ordinary, and in her quietness she kept a ledger, not of money, but of sounds. Yes, she called it the Book of Soft Things. She wrote down things like, the flap of a moth against the window, the sigh Sister Clarice makes before sleep, the drip of wax onto wood, the murmur of rain on wool. Imagine that, a lifetime of noticing, of cataloging small, gentle things. She wrote over 400 entries, and at the end of the book she added, these are the noises that made my soul less alone. What a line, right? Not grand, not famous, but deeply human. We forget that behind the veils were minds, hungry ones, funny ones, brilliant ones, broken ones. Some longed for God, some longed for each other, some longed for the world outside, but made the world inside bloom instead, with songs, with laughter, with ink, with small defiance. And many of them were never caught, not because they were sneaky, but because no one thought to look. They were just the quiet ones, the background. But history, it's richer with them in it. So much richer. So if you're still here, still listening, then rest easy, knowing that even centuries ago, in places we forget, there were people just like you. They had thoughts and dreams and secrets. They whispered jokes in the dark, braided each other's hair, argued about soup, and hummed silly songs when no one was listening. Isn't that strangely comforting? There was something about winter inside a convent. The cold didn't knock loudly. It slipped in, gently, through the cracks in stone, beneath doorways, through poorly fitted glass. And the nuns, they wrapped themselves tighter in their wool cloaks, and moved slower than usual. Not out of laziness, no, but because in the cold, everything feels heavier, even sound, even silence. And it's in that silence that Sister Benedetta once noticed, that the bell in the chapel had a different tone in December. She wrote it down, The bell sounds more hollow now, as if the cold is echoing through it, and back out again. A small thing, maybe, but that's what most convent memories were made of, small things. Now in winter, things also changed in the kitchens. Food became simpler, bread was coarser, turnips were more common than apples, butter was but still, the sisters found joy where they could. There's a quiet record from a convent in Burgundy where they wrote, "Today we made a pudding of oats and clove. It warmed the spirit." Just that, a pudding, simple, warm, and shared. They didn't need grand feast, just something to hold in their hands when the wind howled outside. Ah, and did you know they made candles, lots of them, by hand, one by one? Some nuns spent entire weeks dipping wicks into beeswax, over and over, until the candles grew thick enough. And it wasn't just work, it was rhythmic. Dip, wait, lift, dip, wait, lift, lift. Sometimes they sang softly while doing it. Other times, they simply listened to the sound of the wax cooling, the gentle crackle. There's something so soft about that image, isn't there? And in that cold, in that calm, letters still came, from mothers, from bishops, from old friends in other convents. Sister Elisabetta once received a letter from her cousin, who lived far beyond the convent walls. It said, "The outside world is noisy, full of carts and dogs and markets, but sometimes, I wish to hear only what you hear." That letter stayed with her for years. She tucked it into her psalter, and sometimes when the nights felt too long, she would unfold it, smooth it flat, and read it aloud to herself. Not because the words were grand, but because someone somewhere was thinking of her, even behind the walls, even in the silence. We all want to be remembered, don't we? And the scandals, yes, even in winter they lingered, not loud, not burning, but quiet and warm, like a coal under a blanket. Sister Clare in the late 1300s had a friend, a very close one, another sister. They worked in the library together. They copied books side by side, hand over hand, for hours at a time, and no one thought much of it, until one day, Clare stopped copying. She simply sat, quill in hand, ink full, but she didn't write. She just looked out the small icy window. When asked why, she said, "I miss the way she used to hum while writing." That was all. No confession, no scandalous behavior, just a quiet grief. And yet, the abbess asked her to sleep in a different dormitory, farther away. They weren't punished, just separated, a soft discipline. And both nuns, slowly, stopped writing, not because they were forbidden, but because perhaps the ink didn't feel the same anymore. Is that scandal? Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe it was love, or friendship, or just longing. Whatever it was, it didn't burn the convent down, but it did leave an echo, and that echo lasted longer than most realize. Even today, if you visit the ruins of that old convent, they say you can still find fragments of parchment in the dust, unfinished verses. One reads, "Your hand was warmer than mine, and softer." There's more scandal in gentleness than most suspect. And speaking of parchment, did you know many nuns became master copyists? They didn't just copy the Bible, they copied herbal remedies, cookbooks, letters, even poems. Some even made small illustrations, tiny vines creeping through the margins, a bird here, a star there, all done with care, with patience, with love. And in one particular manuscript, found centuries later, there's a note at the bottom of the page. "I laughed today. Sister Berenice sneezed during the Psalms, and no one scolded her." It's these little notes, these human crumbs, that make the past feel real. Not the battles, not the kings, but the sneeze during Psalms. Winter also brought dreams, long nights, longer sleep. The sisters shared dreams sometimes. Not always aloud, but they would sometimes hint. Sister Jean once told her neighbor, "I dreamed of wheat taller than me, and a sky that hummed like bees." That's it, no sermon, no warning, just a dream. But the other sister remembered it. For years, Because sometimes when all you have are walls and silence, dreams become more vivid, more precious, more real. And when spring finally came, the nuns did not dance or shout. They just noticed a snowdrop blooming near the cloister gate, the bees waking slowly in the hive boxes, the stone warming slightly under their bare feet, and they returned to their tasks, humming, whispering prayers, dipping wicks, but with just a little more color in their cheeks. And when they passed the garden, they would smile. Not because spring had come, but because it had come again.
Ah,
Cycles, seasons, silences. That's what life was for them. Not scandal after scandal, but soft moments in between. Scandal only stood out because the rest of life was so calm, so controlled, so quiet. It made even a touch on the hand feel electric, even a glance across the refectory feel like thunder. And in that quiet, so much was said, without words. Just like tonight, you've listened quietly, and maybe now, the quiet feels like a friend. The year was turning again. The air smelled slightly different, softer, a little more damp, as if the earth was waking up, slowly, quietly. Inside the convent, Sister Elodian noticed the birds returned before anyone else. Not because they were loud, but because she'd always leave the window just a little bit open. Even in winter, just a crack, so she could hear them when they came back. And one morning, very early, still dark, she heard the fluttering of wings, and smiled before even opening her eyes. "They're back," she whispered to no one. That same morning, Sister Therese, known for speaking only when necessary, walked into the cloister garden and stood very still. She tilted her head, and then she said, softly, "I smell violets." The other nuns smiled. Spring had arrived, and with it, new routines. The herbs in the apothecary had to be sorted again. Nettles, mint, sage, lavender, lemon balm, each one labeled carefully. The soft brown parchment tags hung on twine, written with quiet precision. Even the ink had a scent, a little like walnuts, a little like iron. And as the days warmed, the sisters began to walk a little slower, not out of fatigue, but to enjoy. Now, you might be wondering what happened to all those little stories, all the whispers, the glances, the soft touches, the lingering fingers during morning blessings. They didn't stop, but they changed, just a little, softer still, more careful, but more daring, in a strange way. Because with the warmth of spring, came risk. Open windows meant open ears, and yet, love, whatever kind it was, tends to find a way, doesn't it? In one convent, deep in the French countryside, two sisters were tasked with tending the beehives. You might think that sounds uneventful, but the hives were placed at the very edge of the garden, beyond the last wall of roses, just out of view from the main building. And those two sisters, Agneta and Rose, spent a great deal of time among the bees. Too much, some thought, but no one questioned it directly. After all, the honey was excellent, and their hands always came back sticky with wax and sweetness. One day, Agneta wrote a single line in the corner of a gardening book. "Your laughter makes the bees less angry." No name, no explanation, but Rose found it, and tucked a petal of dried lavender between the pages in reply. Was it scandal? Maybe to the bishop, maybe to the rules, but not to them. To them it was survival, a kind of quiet joy that made the long days easier, and the long prayers a little more bearable. In another convent, this time in the Low Countries, there was an elderly nun named Sister Amalia. She didn't speak much. She walked with a limp and carried a basket everywhere she went. The basket always held the same things: a candle, a cloth, and a tin of salve. No one ever asked her why, until one day, a new novice, barely 16, fell on the stone steps and scraped her knee. Amalia appeared almost instantly. Without speaking, she knelt, pulled the cloth from the basket, dabbed the blood, then smeared on the salve, and the girl said, "That feels warm," to which Amalia finally spoke. "Just once," she said, "everything we touch should." A few of the older nuns claimed that Amalia had once been caught kissing another sister, decades earlier, but the abbess at the time hadn't punished them. She had simply said, "Let them remember softness. The world outside won't be so kind. Even the most devout among them. Even those who prayed the longest hours, who fasted for weeks, who sang with closed eyes and trembling voices. They too remembered hands. Not sinful, just human." One of the most worn psalters in the convent had a tiny note tucked inside its cover. Very old. The ink had almost vanished. It said, "Her thumb brushed mine during matins. I forgot the verse. That's it, but that's enough. Sometimes all it takes is a brush of skin." And what about the others? The ones who didn't understand, who whispered behind backs, who kept tallies of sins that were never confessed. Well, some of them weren't cruel, just scared, afraid of desire, afraid of softness, afraid that a single moment of warmth could undo their years of discipline. There's a journal from an abbess in 1411. She wrote, "Today I caught Sister Elena looking too long at Sister Beatrice. I did not scold her. I simply reminded her to focus her eyes on the Lord." But then, 2 pages later, she added, "But what if the Lord lives in Beatrice's eyes?" Even she was questioning, even the abbess. The truth is, love, affection, connection, doesn't stop for walls, or prayers, or habits. It finds the gaps. It grows in the cracks between rules, just like violets through the stone. There was a custom, in one northern convent, where the sisters would light a single extra candle on the first full moon of spring. Not for a saint, not for Mary, but simply for that which is hidden. No one ever explained what that meant. It wasn't written down, but every sister lit the candle, silently, and they watched it burn. And some believed that candle was for secrets, for memories, for moments not spoken aloud. So when you think of scandals, carnal or otherwise, try to think gently. Don't imagine shouting or fire or punishment. Imagine candlelight on a stone wall, a dried flower in a psalter, 2 hands brushing in silence, a line of ink that took hours to form, and only seconds to mean everything. That was the true heartbeat of those convents. Not the rules, but the breaks in between. And in those breaks, they lived. That evening, as dusk draped its violet cloth over the convent roofs, something quiet happened. Not a scandal, not a whisper, just a feeling, the kind that drifts slowly through the corridors, brushing against the old tapestries, curling up between hymnals and prayer scrolls, a hush that isn't silence, but presence. Sister Magdalene stood in the apothecary. She was mixing a balm, gently grinding dried rose petals and thyme into a smooth, fragrant paste. Each motion was slow, circular, soft. She wasn't thinking of the recipe. She was thinking of a voice, low and delicate. Not even words, just the sound of another sister breathing, while they worked side by side. "I hope she helps with the linen folding again tonight," Magdalene whispered into the mortar bowl. That sister, her name was Claire, and unlike Magdalene, Claire had once been part of the outside world, the real world. She had danced once, in a hall, with a man whose name she had forgotten, but she remembered the music, the way it made her feel warm in her ribs. Still, it didn't last. After her father's passing, and her brother's debts, Claire was placed into the convent as repayment to the church. That happened more often than you'd think. Not all nuns came by choice, but many stayed willingly, once they discovered a different kind of love. Not loud, not wild, just steady, like a soft thread weaving through the days. Tonight Claire found a folded scrap of paper near her pillow. It had no name, only one sentence, carefully written. "If heaven has eyes, I hope they're shaped like yours." She smiled. No one needed to explain, not in places like this. That night, she walked a little slower through the stone hallway. Her hand brushed the wall gently as she passed the candle niches. And in the laundry room, tucked behind drying robes, Magdalene pretended not to wait. She wasn't very good at pretending. Elsewhere in the convent, Sister Eugenie played the psaltery with trembling fingers. She was old now, her back curved like a willow branch, but the instrument still knew her touch. She played hymns, yes, but sometimes, she let her fingers wander into melodies that had no name, just sounds that came from deep memory, from places her mind no longer fully reached. But her hands still remembered. The other sisters listened, not for the notes, but for the space between them. That space was where the beauty lived. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't this supposed to be about scandal? Yes, but scandal doesn't always mean loudness. Sometimes scandal is subtle. A feeling kept hidden too long. A laugh during silence. A blush that lasts a little too long at morning prayers. A secret pressed flower tucked between the pages of the Rule of Saint Benedict. Scandal, they said. But what they meant was a truth we don't know how to name. There was a garden behind the convent. Not large, just a simple circle of herbs. And a few crooked apple trees. But in spring, the blossoms made the entire cloister smell like honey and new wool. That's where Sister Lucia would go, always at the same hour, just before complain. She would sit by the furthest apple tree, a small book open in her lap, and her eyes half closed, not asleep, just remembering. Sometimes another sister would walk past her, slow her step, maybe pause. Once, Sister Beta knelt down beside her and said nothing. They sat for 20 minutes, no words, just warmth. Their shoulders touched, and neither of them flinched. Inside the scriptorium, Sister Petronilla copied a psalm onto vellum. Line by line, the script was perfect, almost too perfect, like it was hiding something, because beneath each line of prayer, she had etched, with the finest needle and palest ink, a poem, invisible unless you tilted the parchment just right in the candlelight. It read, "Her silence makes me weep softer than confession ever could." Not a single sister knew, except one, and she kept the page when Petronilla left the convent to serve in another priory. She never told anyone. She just kept it folded inside her breviary, next to a dried sprig of rosemary. And once a year she would unfold it, read it again, and then close it without a sound. Do you see now? These were not wild affairs, not noisy betrayals. They were ribbons of affection hidden in a sea of silence. They were what held many of these women together, because outside the convent walls, life was not softer. Out there, a woman could not speak without permission. Out there, her love was dictated by marriage contracts, dowries, and alliances. In here, behind thick stone and soft veils, she could love as quietly or as boldly as she dared. And that was the scandal. Not that it happened, but that it was beautiful. That it was chosen. That it was human. There's a record in a dusty book of a bishop who tried to cleanse a certain convent of affections unbecoming. He wrote, "Too many women gaze at each other with long affection. It dulls the spirit and leads the soul to confusion." But then, at the bottom of that page, in different ink, much later, someone had scribbled, "Or maybe it leads the soul home." Whoever wrote that, thank you. Because maybe that's what this has always been. A story of coming home. Tomorrow, the bells will ring again. Chants will echo through the stone halls. The sisters will rise, pray, work, and sleep. But in between, there will be laughter. There will be hands brushing in candlelight. There will be petals, and poems, and soft glances, and maybe, just maybe, a psalm sung a little sweeter, because the singer is thinking of someone else's voice. Yes, that's the truth of it. And if you listen closely, you might hear it too. Even now, there's something about the way moonlight touches old stone, soft and cold, but not unfriendly, just distant. And under that moonlight, as it poured like pale milk across the cloister floor, Sister Anna moved quietly. Her sandals made no sound on the smooth flagstones. It was long past compline, but not yet met that strange, still hour in between. When the world forgets to watch, that was when Anna liked to walk, not for any reason, not to rebel, not to seek, just to feel the hush, that special hush that only existed when every sister slept. The wind outside sighed gently, and the candles had long melted into pools of wax. She walked to the small window in the east corridor, the one no one ever cleaned properly, and she looked out, at what? Nothing, just darkness. A little frost on the grass, the suggestion of distant trees, but her eyes stayed there, unmoving, because sometimes the soul looks outward to look inward. Strange, isn't it? But not uncommon here. Behind her down the hall, a faint rustling, Sister Inez. Again, she always woke at this hour, and always wandered just behind Anna, without saying a word, not following, not stalking, just echoing. They never spoke about it, not once, but every night for nearly a month. Their feet traced the same loop through the convent, Anna leading, Inez a few steps behind, both in silence, both in rhythm. And something about that, felt closer than words. In the refectory, where the sisters usually ate in silence under a fresco of the Last Supper, someone had left a loaf of bread, wrapped in cloth. Beside it, a single candle burned low, and pinned to the wrapping, a tiny scrap of parchment, 2 letters, MC. No one would ever know for certain, but perhaps Magdalene had made bread, and perhaps Claire had been hungry, and perhaps that candlelight was enough warmth for a smile shared in secret. Small scandals, but very human ones. Elsewhere, Sister Agnes stared into a cracked mirror. It was the only one in the convent, and it wasn't supposed to be used for anything other than grooming before Mass. But tonight, Agnes simply looked at herself, at the slow changes time was carving into her face, at the softness near her eyes, at the way her veil no longer sat straight, but slightly off-center. "I used to hate this face," she whispered. "Now I see her, and I feel sorry." That wasn't scandal, but it was honesty, and in places like these, honesty was a kind of quiet rebellion. "Do you remember Sister Eugenie, the one with the psaltery and the trembling hands?" Tonight, she didn't play. Instead, she sat by the fire and told a story to the novices. Not a biblical tale, not a saint's life, but a memory. "When I was 12, she said softly, "my aunt taught me how to kiss my own hand, so I would always remember that someone loved me, even if no one else showed it." The novices giggled. Then they all kissed their own hands, some out of playfulness, some with tears they didn't understand, and Eugenie just smiled, and tucked her hands back under her shawl. "It works better when it's snowing," she added. There was snow now, falling quietly outside. Just a little. Just enough to gather on the roof tiles and whisper down into the cracks of the stone. Have you ever listened to snow? Not the wind, not the cold, but snow? It makes a sound like no other. A hush that isn't silent, a weight that isn't heavy. Sister Julita, the youngest among them, had never seen real snowfall until she came to the convent. She had arrived from a southern village, dry and warm, and on her first snow, she ran out barefoot into the courtyard and spun. Arms wide, mouth open like a child catching sugar. "It's cold," she gasped. "But it's nice." And then, without knowing why, she cried. She cried into the snow, and another sister, Sister Therese, wrapped her in a cloak and didn't ask questions. She just let her cry, because sometimes that's all you need. Someone to let you feel. Would you believe that even in the strictest convents, they sometimes kept animals, not pets exactly, but small ones. Cats for catching mice, doves for messages, even a goat or two for milk, and oh how the sisters loved those animals. There was one cat, named Morel. She belonged to no one, but slept in every sister's bed at least once. She knew where to find the warmest corners, the softest laps, and the places where the candle soot couldn't reach her fur. Morel was silent company, but very much loved. One night, she curled up beside Sister Inez, who hadn't spoken aloud in nearly a week, and when Inez began to cry softly in her sleep, Morel didn't move, just pressed closer, until the shaking slowed. That's not in the church records, but it happened, and it mattered. Now outside the convent, the world was still spinning. There were lords feasting, knights riding, monks copying books by lantern light. But inside this little world, the scandal wasn't in what was done. It was in what was felt, and what was shared, even in whispers beneath the vow of silence: love, grief, touch, music, bread, mirrors, and cats. The sacred things. It's late now, dear listener. The candles are low again. The sisters are breathing softly in their cells. And someone, maybe Sister Magdalene, is humming under her breath as she folds linen. Not a hymn this time. Just a little tune that sounds like home. There it is again. That little creak, the one near the old staircase, where the boards had bowed ever so slightly from years of quiet footsteps. No one had fixed it, not because they hadn't noticed, but because in a place like this, even the creaks were part of the rhythm. That night, Sister Claire stood at the top of those stairs, a candle in her hand, barely flickering. She wasn't supposed to be there, not at that hour, not with a candle, and certainly not with the small book tucked under her sleeve. It wasn't a book of psalms. It wasn't even a book from the Abbey's library. It was a tiny thing, hand-bound, its cover a soft leather, worn smooth by someone's nervous thumb. She had found it long ago, hidden beneath a loose floor tile under the choir stall. No name, no date, but the pages were poetry. Soft, strange, longing poetry. I dreamed of water in the desert, but found a desert in the sea. She didn't know who wrote it, but it felt like someone who once stood in that very spot. Someone who had felt the pull between devotion and desire. And tonight, Claire just needed to read a few lines again. Not to rebel, not to challenge her vows, just to remember that someone else had felt the same. Far below, in the warmest corner of the cellar, Sister Adelaide slept with one hand resting on an old, worn satchel. Inside was a bundle of herbs she had collected that morning, carefully picked from the frost-kissed garden. Not the ones for healing, not the bitter ones used in tinctures, but the sweet-smelling ones. Lavender, mint, chamomile. She liked to tuck them inside the sleeves of the novices before prayer. Just a little surprise. A calming scent. A reminder that the world still had beauty in it. Even when the bells rang cold. You might think that's not much, but in a place where rules weighed heavier than snowfall, even a pinch of mint was a quiet form of kindness. The abbess, Mother Renata, had once caught her doing it. She hadn't said anything at the time. She had simply raised one eyebrow, turned, and walked away. But the next morning, when the sisters gathered for lauds, there was a sprig of lavender on Mother Renata's own prayer book. For strange things, the little rebellions. They don't shout. They whisper. They don't break the rules. They bend them, just enough to let in a little light. Around the third hour of the night, the moon shifted behind a cloud, and just then, in the scriptorium, Sister Leonie dipped her quill in ink, and wrote one word over and over again. Touch. She was supposed to be copying the rule of Saint Benedict. But her mind had drifted, and her hand kept writing touch, touch, touch. She stared at the word until it looked wrong, until the letters blurred, until it felt like a prayer, or maybe a confession. She wiped it away quickly and returned to her task. But later, when she closed the manuscript, she found her hands still tingling. Not from sin, but from memory. Somewhere, near the chapel, Sister Thérèse stood barefoot on the cold floor, arms outstretched toward the ceiling, not in prayer, not in madness, just reaching for something, even she didn't know what. There are things that go unnamed in convent life, yearnings that never find form, questions that never leave the mouth, but they still live there, in the silence, between bells, between hymns, between amen, and go in peace. And you know, not all the scandals came from within. Sometimes they came wrapped in letters. A courier had once arrived late in the night, soaked to the bone from rain, holding a sealed parchment for Sister Mariam. It was addressed from a bishop, and bore a crest no one recognized. Mariam took it silently, and didn't speak for 3 days. On the 4th, she sat down with Sister Agnes, and whispered, "He remembers me." Agnes didn't ask who. She simply took Mariam's hand, and let the silence speak for them. Some letters brought pain, others brought relief, some were burned, others folded carefully and hidden under straw mattresses, reread on dark nights, when the wind cried outside the shutters. Words were precious here, and dangerous, and beautiful, all at once. Now, just before dawn, as the sky began to slip from deep navy into a softer gray, the sisters stirred in their rooms, some still sleeping, some half waking, others sitting quietly in their wooden cells, hands clasped, eyes closed, not praying, just existing. The air smelled of wax, wool and wet stone, and somewhere, a kettle boiled gently over an ember fire, warmth, waiting. Sister Inez folded a blanket with practiced hands. Sister Julita hummed again, off-key, but sweet. And Sister Anna, who had once walked the halls in silence, now stood beside another novice, guiding her through her first recitation of matins, softly, gently, like passing a flame from one candle to the next. No great scandal happened that night. No rules shattered. No vows broken. And yet, the convent changed, just a little, just enough. As it always had, as it always would. Ah, like snow falling in a forgotten courtyard. Quiet, beautiful, unnoticed by the world, but not by us. It was morning now. The kind of morning that arrives without any loud announcement. No golden sunrise, no bird song, just a slow blue-gray light, curling around the edges of wooden shutters, like a whisper. Sister Claire sat by the window in the weaving room, her fingers pulling soft wool thread through a spindle. It wasn't prayer time yet, and she wasn't weaving for a garment. This wasn't for the church, not for the abbess, not for penance. No, today, she was spinning thread just to feel it between her fingers, just to hear the quiet rhythm of twist, pull, breathe, twist, pull, breathe. Sometimes she told herself that's enough worship for one morning. Outside, frost still coated the edges of the cloister garden, and beneath the wooden awning, Sister Lani crouched beside a row of cracked pots. She was humming something soft, a tune she wasn't supposed to know, a tune she had heard only once, long ago, when a minstrel passed by the outer wall on a festival day, and the sound had filtered through like sunlight through stained glass. That melody had stayed, just stayed, and now it came out in little hums while she planted seeds. Parsley, she thought, or maybe fennel, she wasn't quite sure. She liked the not knowing. She liked that things could still surprise her. Sister Lami's hands were always dirty with soil, ink, or wax, depending on the day. And yet, when she held something fragile, like a bruised flower or a bruised heart, she held it softer than anyone else. Across the hall, in the infirmary, Sister Inez wrapped a clean cloth around an old woman's hand. The woman wasn't a nun. She was a wanderer, someone who had knocked on the gate 3 days ago with frost-bitten toes and a fading voice. The convent often took in wanderers. Not all monasteries did, but here, there was still softness. Even when it hurt, even when it meant trouble. Mother Renata hadn't spoken when she saw the woman curled up by the hearth that night. She had only nodded and left a folded blanket on the table beside her. It smelled faintly of lavender. And you know, not all carnal scandals began with secrets or sins. Some began with something simpler, something almost ordinary, like eyes meeting across a cloister corridor, and neither looking away fast enough. Sister Julita had felt it first, she thought, that gentle ache behind her ribs when she saw Sister Agnes reading in the sunlight. Face soft, mouth slightly open, eyes slow blinking like a cat in spring. It wasn't lust. At least, not the kind you'd write about in the church records. It was tenderness, longing, recognition, a sense that something important existed in this other person, something beautiful, something sacred. That's what most people never understood about these scandals. They weren't always about breaking rules. They were often about reaching in quiet ways, for warmth, for kindness, for softness in a world that demanded hardness. One cold evening, Julita had offered her half of a honey biscuit to Agnes, Agnes didn't eat it. She just held it and whispered, "Thank you." Like it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done. It probably was. That night, both women lay in their cells, backs against stone, hands on their own chests, feeling the slow thrum of their hearts. Not in guilt, not in fear, just in silence, in knowing. Sometimes knowing is enough. Now down in the scriptorium, Sister Therese had begun transcribing an older manuscript, one that detailed the lives of saints. Most of them were martyrs, burned, drowned, starved, dismembered. She paused over one name, Saint Euphemia, a girl no older than 13, killed because she refused to marry a man appointed by her father. Therese read the passage twice, then dipped her quill in ink. But instead of writing the saint's name, she wrote, "She chose," and let the ink dry on the word. That's all she needed to say. She chose, not just to suffer, but to claim something, even if only once. Therese folded that parchment and placed it beneath her habit. Later, she would burn it. But for now, it warmed her chest. In the kitchen, Sister Adelaide was quietly stirring a pot of barley stew. She added just a pinch more salt, then reached into the side pouch of her robe and dropped in 3 dried apple slices. Sweetness and something simple. That was her rebellion. They weren't allowed to flavor the stew like that. But she knew the sisters needed it, not because they were hungry for food, but because they were hungry for comfort, a taste of something other than rules. And so, every few days, she snuck in a little fruit, or spice, or just love. She called it her tiny feast. The others never noticed, at least, not out loud, but they always smiled more on those nights. And that was enough for her. Back near the candle room, Claire returned with her little book, the poetry book. She slipped it back beneath the tile in the choir stall, fingers brushing the worn leather one last time. She didn't read it aloud anymore. She didn't need to. It lived in her now. Like a psalm, like a dream, like breath in the lungs. The day continued, quietly, like a soft cloth laid over tired shoulders, like sunlight warming stone. The sisters went about their chores, their prayers, their silences, and though no one said it, they were all carrying something more than devotion. They carried each other, in little ways, in tiny kindnesses, in warm biscuits, in humming songs, in secret poems, and shared glances, and hands held too long during morning blessings. Not sinful, not shameful, just human, beautiful human. The world outside the convent was always loud, not just in sound, but in weight, in expectations, in demands. But here, within the thick walls wrapped in cold stone and candlelight, everything moved slower, like honey in winter, like thoughts before waking. Sister Adela sat beneath the old olive tree in the cloister yard. Its bark was twisted, like a story retold too many times, but its shade was still kind. A little patch of earth beside it had once held herbs for medicines. Now, just soft moss and one lonely violet. Adela didn't mind. She just watched it grow, one petal at a time. Like everything else in the convent, it asked for no permission, no applause. It just existed, and in that there was peace. She wasn't always so peaceful. There was a time, not too long ago, when she felt pulled toward the outer gate, where letters arrived, where visitors sometimes came with tears in their eyes. A world buzzing and blooming just outside their quiet little island. But then, she realized something. She wasn't missing out. She was still in a world just a smaller one, and it held just as much sorrow, sweetness and strange surprise, like Sister Lucia. Yes. Sister Lucia. She never did speak much, not because she'd taken a vow of silence, but because, well, no one ever quite understood her. She spent her afternoons tending to the beehives. Yes, the convent had bees, 3 little woven skeps tucked near the back wall where sunlight hit longest. Lucia would sit there for hours, head bowed, veil tucked behind her ears, just listening to the bees hum. Some said she sang to them in Latin. Some said she told them stories, and one sister claimed she saw Lucia kiss the bees goodbye each winter. No one ever confirmed it, and no one asked, because sometimes mystery feels like respect. One evening, after Vespers, Sister Lucia brought a small jar of honey to the refectory. She placed it at the center table, and walked away. The sisters didn't speak. They just passed the jar quietly, from hand to hand. Each took a small taste, just a finger's dab, and for that whole night, not one single word of bitterness was spoken between them. Maybe it was just the honey, or maybe it was something else, something carried in the silence. Now, in another part of the convent, beneath the worn stairs that led to the bell tower, Sister Julita sat with a half-broken violin. No strings, no bow, just the frame. She'd found it buried in the storeroom. Likely abandoned, likely forgotten. She didn't play it, she just held it, ran her fingers along the wood. Imagined the sounds it must have once made. She imagined a girl standing in a garden, centuries ago, playing the same violin as the rain began to fall. Sometimes imagination was enough. In the convent it had to be. There were many small rituals the church never recorded. Tiny acts of devotion that had no name in scripture, like warming another's boots by the hearth before dawn, or folding someone's veil just right so it didn't press on their forehead, or slipping a pressed flower between pages of a prayer book for someone else to find. These weren't the kind of things that caused scandals, but they were the kind of things that revealed hearts. And hearts are often the quietest troublemakers of all. Long ago the abbess had warned them. She said temptation doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it comes with warm bread, or soft words, or hands that linger too long on your shoulder. But what if temptation wasn't always bad? What if it was just a soul reaching for another, for comfort, for witness, for someone to say, I see you? It was hard to tell, especially when the church said one thing, and your own spirit whispered another. Some nights, Sister Clara would slip out of her bed just before midnight prayers. Not to sin, not to run, just to breathe. She'd sit beneath the old window in the hallway that faced the forest. Sometimes there'd be an owl, sometimes fog, sometimes just the stars. She always thought better in the dark, and sometimes she'd bring a second cloak, in case someone else joined her. They often did, never the same person twice, never for long, just enough to share the silence, to press shoulders together like old stones in a wall, and say nothing, and say everything. You won't read those stories in any monastery record, but they happened, as surely as the wind moved through the courtyard, as surely as the bees came back each spring. One story whispered between the youngest novices, told of two sisters who carved their names into the stone wall beneath the chapel stairs. Just tiny initials, side by side. No one knew who they were, but every girl who found those marks paused and smiled, like a secret passed through time, not sinful, not shameful, just soft, real, human. And maybe that's the deepest truth about the carnal scandals of nuns. They weren't always about bodies, they were about hearts that longed to feel, souls that craved warmth, women who lived in silence, but carried entire symphonies within. And every now and then, a note would escape, and someone else would hear it, and the world would become softer. As the night deepened, and the candles in the chapel burned low, a few sisters lingered in the shadows of the nave, not praying, just breathing, just being, just sharing the same space as equals, as sisters, as something more than their vows allowed them to say. And somewhere outside the walls, a new wind stirred in the trees. It didn't matter what the world called them. It didn't matter what the records said. They were not wicked. They were not fallen. They were simply alive. And maybe that's the most forbidden thing of all. Hi again. So here we are. One final hush before the candle burns out. One last glance down the worn cloister path, where soft sandals once brushed over mossy stones, and prayers mixed with unspoken things. The convent was quiet tonight. Not just in sound, but in feeling. Like something had passed through. A wave, A sigh, a shared secret finally exhaled. It wasn't guilt, no. It was something gentler, more accepting. Like the earth, remembering rain. Like linen remembering skin. Sister Adela sat by the garden wall again, beneath that same twisted olive tree, where she had once wondered about the outside world. But now, she wondered more about herself. Not in a troubled way, but in that sleepy, slow kind of wondering that comes when you finally feel safe enough to be curious. She brushed her fingers across her wooden rosary, not saying any prayers, just feeling the beads. One by one, each one was a memory now. A tiny polished stone of her time here. Moments that no one ever wrote down. Moments that mattered anyway. She remembered Sister Lucia's bees, and the quiet hum of life they brought into the stillness. She remembered the little jar of honey passed between hands that had once been clenched in judgment, but softened that night, with sweetness. She remembered the warmth that spread in the chest, when you knew someone cared, without ever saying it out loud. Ah, so many quiet rebellions lived inside this place. Not with shouting, but with softness, with care. Up in the scriptorium, Sister Marta was still copying old texts. Her ink had dried more than once tonight, but she didn't mind. She wasn't rushing, she just enjoyed the feel of the quill against the parchment. That little scratch, scratch, scratch. Sometimes, she'd sneak a smiley face in the margins, or a tiny heart, just for herself, or maybe, for the next woman who would hold the book, years later, and smile too. Even monks wouldn't notice. They never looked for love in the footnotes. The wind outside began to pick up just a little. Not harsh, just enough to tickle the chapel bells with a low chime. Like the world itself was whispering. Not scolding, not warning, just whispering. Still here. Still listening. In the infirmary, Sister Clara tucked a blanket around one of the older nuns. She wasn't ill, just cold. Clara didn't speak. She just pressed her hand for a moment on the sister's shoulder, before walking away. Kindness never needed to ask permission. It just happened, and that was what made it holy. In the oldest part of the convent, past the weeping stone archway, there was a little door, locked for years, but behind it, an old library, filled with forgotten things, journals, letters, sketches, and tucked in one drawer, a ribbon, faded pink, still holding the scent of rosemary and ash. No one knew whose it was, but the sisters passed the drawer quietly between them, sometimes opening it late at night, just to feel a little closer to someone they'd never meet. Someone like them, someone who had once loved in silence. There had been scandals, yes, affairs, runaways, secret children, but there had also been poetry, and laughter, and long looks shared in gardens while petals fell like whispers. History forgot the soft things. It remembered the punishments. It remembered the rules broken. But it never remembered the moments when someone felt seen, even if only once. Even if it cost them everything. Was that a scandal, or just being human? Hard to say. Maybe both. On the last night before Adela was to take her final vows, she wrote something in the margins of a borrowed psalter. Just 3 words. We were here. No one would know who wrote it, but she smiled, closed the book and slid it back onto the shelf. Maybe one day, someone would find it, and maybe that would be enough. As dawn crept toward the edge of the sky, the sisters gathered one last time. Not in the chapel, not in the refectory, just in the garden, barefoot, silent, each carrying a single white flower. They didn't say why. They didn't say who it was for. They simply placed the flowers around the olive tree, one by one, until the base of it looked like snow had fallen. They stood in a circle, eyes closed, and then walked away. No one spoke, because nothing more needed to be said. The scandals weren't always scandalous. They were just stories of longing, of confusion, of women trying to find God in each other's eyes, and sometimes finding themselves instead, of warmth in places where they were told warmth didn't belong, of love that dared to be kind, even if it couldn't be named. Some called them sinners, some called them saints, but in the quiet of this story, where we let judgment sleep, they were simply human, soft, complicated, lonely, brave, They lived their truth in glances, in gardens, in giggles behind stone columns, and when they broke the rules, they did it with flowers in their hands, not fire. Ah, not one of them asked to be remembered, but somehow in this soft little tale, they are, still here, still whispering, still walking barefoot through the garden, just before dawn. If you are still awake, then I think you have to see the video from the 19th minute of the story, or play this side video as maybe it can help you sleep better.